Commander Eric Vale's heart pounded in his chest as the blaring alarms of the U.S. Vanguard echoed through the corridors. The starship was in chaos. Explosions rocked the ship, shaking it from all sides as enemy forces descended on them like a swarm of angry hornets. Eric, though a seasoned officer, couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. The mission to establish peaceful trade routes with the alien race known as the Zhorna had gone horribly wrong. A sudden ambush from a rival faction, the Rutheri Empire, had turned the peaceful negotiation into a deadly firefight. "Sir, we're losing power to the forward engines," his communications officer, Lieutenant Zora Blackwell, shouted, her face pale as she gripped the control panel. "Get us out of here." Eric barked, gripping the seat in front of him as another explosion rocked the ship. The emergency lights flickered, casting an eerie red glow over everything. The Vanguard was listing badly now, its hull beginning to buckle under the relentless fire from the Rutheri ships. Their technology was far superior, and it was clear that the Vanguard, and everyone aboard, was at the mercy of a more advanced enemy. He knew it was only a matter of time before the ship would be torn apart. "Prepare the escape pods," Eric ordered, his voice unwavering despite the panic he felt rising within. He had to be strong for his crew, even if it felt like they were facing certain death. As the crew scrambled to follow his orders, Eric made his way to the nearest escape pod, hoping that the enemy wouldn't catch wind of their plan. But the Rutheri were relentless. They knew the Vanguard was no longer in fighting shape, and they would be coming for anyone who tried to escape. "Commander Vale," Zora's voice crackled through the comms. "The escape pods are launching. You need to." The message was cut off by a deafening roar, followed by a wave of shock that sent Eric tumbling to the floor. His vision swam as the ship's systems failed one by one. The Vanguard was dying, and with it, so were its crew, unless they could find a way to survive. In that moment of chaos, the ship's outer hull finally gave way, sending Eric flying through the air. His last thoughts were of his crew, his family, and the knowledge that the battle was far from over. They weren't just fighting for survival now. They were fighting to stay alive in a universe that had no mercy for the weak. And then, everything went black. When Eric awoke, he was no longer aboard the Vanguard. The ground beneath him was hard and uneven, and the air was thick with dust. His head throbbed, and he groggily pushed himself into a sitting position, his eyes squinting against the harsh sunlight. He was on a barren, desert-like planet, its orange sands stretching out as far as he could see. His escape pod had crash-landed somewhere, and though he had no idea how far from the wreckage of the Vanguard one thing was certain: he was stranded. His heart raced as the reality of his situation hit him. He was alone. His crew was gone, and the Rutheri weren't the only threat he had to worry about. As he surveyed the desolate landscape, he noticed strange ships hovering in the distance, their shapes sleek and alien. They weren't Rutheri, but Eric had learned the hard way not to trust anyone too quickly in this part of space. Just as he began to stand, dust swirling around him, one of the ships darted closer. Panic surged through him, but before he could make a move, the ship landed silently, and the hatch opened. A figure stepped out, a woman clad in a dark, armored suit with a long, flowing cloak. She carried herself with an air of authority that immediately caught Eric's attention. "Stay where you are," the woman commanded, her voice calm but firm. "I won't harm you." Eric's mind raced. Who was this? Was she a friend or another enemy? As the woman approached, he instinctively reached for his weapon, but she was faster, her own blade drawn in a flash. "Who are you?" Eric demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady as he faced the mysterious figure. The woman paused for a moment, her gaze locking with his. "I am Captain Siren Falre," she said, her tone almost unreadable. "And you are lucky I found you." Before Eric could respond, the distant sound of incoming ships reached their ears. Eric turned sharply, his heart sinking as he realized the Rutheri were closing in. His time was running out, and the mysterious captain standing before him was his only hope for survival. The moment Eric saw the incoming Rutheri ships, panic surged through him. His mind raced, the crushing reality of his situation sinking in. He was stranded on an alien planet with no backup and no hope of reinforcements. The Rutheri were ruthless, and if they caught him, they would show no mercy. His eyes darted back to Captain Sirin Falra, who stood confidently, as though the approaching danger meant little to her. "Stay close, Commander Vale," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I'll get us out of here." Eric didn't have time to argue. As the alien ships began to descend from the sky, he quickly followed Sirin, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his side. The Thalaran captain moved with impressive speed, her every step calculated and purposeful, as if she had dealt with situations like this 1,000 times before. She led him to a hidden path that ran between large, jagged rock formations, the only cover in sight. "Are we going to make it?" Eric asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sirin's gaze remained fixed ahead. "We have a chance. I'm not going to let them take you, Commander." Eric was taken aback by her words. The calm certainty in her voice made it seem as though she had everything under control. But he knew better. The Rutheri were formidable. Their ships were faster, their weapons deadlier. Still, he found himself trusting her in a way he couldn't explain. The harsh reality of their situation settled in, but for the first time since the Vanguard had been attacked, he felt a flicker of hope. They ran for what felt like hours, the oppressive heat of the planet making every breath feel heavier. Eric's muscles ached, and his thoughts were clouded with doubts, but he forced himself to keep going. They had to survive. For the crew of the Vanguard. For Earth. For everything. Finally, Sirin led them to a narrow valley, hidden by towering rock walls that shielded them from the Rutheri ships above. There in the shadow of the cliffs sat her ship, sleek, advanced, and undeniably alien. The ship shimmered under the sun, a beautiful but deadly machine. It looked nothing like the ships Eric was used to. It was almost as if the ship itself had a life of its own, breathing in the wind, responding to the environment. "This is your ship?" Eric asked, still trying to catch his breath. Sirin nodded, her expression unreadable. "It is. Now, get aboard quickly. We don't have much time." Eric hesitated for a moment, but then followed her. The hatch opened silently, and he stepped into the unfamiliar ship. Inside, everything was sleek, advanced, and functional. Alien technology surrounded him, and yet there was something strangely intuitive about it. As he buckled into the seat beside Sirin at the controls, he couldn't help but marvel at how quickly she worked. Within seconds, the ship began to hum to life, and the ground beneath them started to tremble as the engines powered up. Sirin didn't waste a word. She was already in full command mode, her fingers dancing over the controls with practiced ease. The Rutheri ships were closing in fast, their dark shapes casting a shadow over the desert below. Eric could see them in the distance, their weapons charging. "How are we going to get past them?" Eric asked, his voice tense. "You'll see," Sirin replied, her eyes focused, unwavering. "Stay calm." With a sudden jolt, the ship shot forward, its engines roaring to life. Eric's stomach dropped as they raced through the sky, the planet's surface dropping away beneath them. The Rutheri ships followed, but Sirin's ship was faster, darting in and out of the atmosphere with unmatched agility. Eric gripped the seat, his heart racing, as he tried to process everything that had just happened. "We're not out of danger yet," Sirin said, her voice steady even in the heat of the chase. "The Rutheri are relentless, but they won't catch us." Eric's mind was spinning, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a leader, calculating and efficient. In that moment, Eric realized that despite their differences, despite the galaxy between them, they shared a common goal: survival. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice finally breaking the tension. "You don't even know me. Why risk everything for a human?" Saren's gaze flicked briefly to him, and for a moment there was something almost softer in her eyes. "Because sometimes, Commander Vale, survival is more than just a matter of chance. It's about alliances, about who we can trust. And right now, we're all each other has." As they pushed deeper into space, away from the planet and the Rutheri threat, Eric felt an unfamiliar sense of resolve settle over him. He wasn't alone anymore. And whatever came next, he knew that his fate, and perhaps the fate of the entire galaxy, was now bound to the mysterious, fierce Captain Saren Falra. The Astrakal soared through the vast expanse of space, its sleek form darting between distant stars like a phantom. Commander Eric Vale sat in the ship's observation room, staring out at the endless black. The harsh desert planet they had escaped from was now far behind them, and the Rutheri threat seemed to have faded into the distance. Yet, even in the silence of space, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking, just beyond the stars. Beside him, Captain Saren Falra stood, her hands clasped behind her back as she studied the star map displayed in front of them. There was a quiet tension between them, an unspoken understanding that they were not safe yet. The Rutheri might have been left behind, but the galaxy was far more complicated than just a single threat. "We need to regroup," Saren said after a long pause, her voice calm yet filled with purpose. "The Rutheri won't stop hunting us. They've already sent a fleet to track us down. If we don't act fast, we'll be caught." Eric nodded. The reality of their situation hit him hard. He was no longer just a commander leading a mission. He was now a fugitive, a piece in a much larger game he didn't fully understand. And in this game, Saren was the only ally he had. "We can't outrun them forever," Eric said, his mind racing through possible options. "We need allies. But who can we trust?" Saren turned to him, her eyes steady. "There are other factions in this galaxy, some who would be willing to join us if we prove ourselves. But they won't do so lightly. Trust is earned, Commander. And right now, we don't have much to offer." Eric leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts turned to the Vanguard and the crew he had lost. He couldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. He had to survive, not just for himself, but for them, too. "Then we fight," he said, his voice steady. "We fight for whatever allies we can find. We have to show them we're not weak, that we can stand up against the Rutheri." Saren gave him a sharp look, her gaze unwavering. "Fighting is never simple. It's not just about strength. If we push too hard, we risk making enemies instead of allies. We need to be strategic." Eric's frustration flared. He was used to the straightforward military tactics of the human fleet, where you strike first, you win. But he was beginning to understand that in this part of the galaxy, things weren't so simple. "So, what's the plan?" Saren didn't respond right away, instead stepping over to the communication console. Her fingers flew over the controls, sending out a signal to an encrypted channel. The room was silent for a long moment, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound. Finally, a crackling voice came through the speakers. "This is Commander Xara of the Taulan Coalition," the voice said, sharp and authoritative. "You've made contact. Now, what do you want?" Eric raised an eyebrow, impressed by the directness of the response. It was clear they weren't going to waste any time. Saren wasted no time explaining their situation, telling Xara about the Rutheri threat and the dire need for an alliance. Eric watched as Saren spoke with calculated precision, her voice calm and composed. When she finished, there was a long pause. Finally, Xara's voice came through again, this time with a hint of uncertainty. "The Taulan have no love for the Rutheri, but we don't make deals lightly. We'll need proof that you can hold your own in a fight. If you can do that, we'll consider joining forces." Saren turned to Eric, her expression unreadable. "Looks like we have our first test." Eric stood up, his muscles tense with the weight of what was to come. They would need to prove themselves, and he had no intention of failing. This was no longer just about survival. It was about building something that could fight back against the overwhelming power of the Ruthuri. They would need allies, and they would need to win their trust. "We'll fight," Eric said, determination in his voice. "And we'll win." As Saren nodded in agreement, the ship's alarms blared suddenly. Eric's heart skipped a beat. The Ruthuri had found them. The price of survival had just become more expensive. The alarms blared through the Astrakal, their shrill warning cutting through the quiet tension that had settled over the ship. Eric Vale's heart skipped a beat as his gaze flicked to the main screen, where the blip of enemy ships grew larger and more ominous with every passing second. The Ruthuri had found them. There was no mistaking the sleek black ships that hovered like a swarm of locusts in the cold vacuum of space. Captain Saren Falra didn't flinch. She moved quickly and decisively, her hands flying over the controls as she activated the ship's shields and weapon systems. Eric watched, impressed by the calm precision she displayed under pressure. It was clear that Saren was no stranger to danger, and in this moment, her focus was absolute. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Saren called over her shoulder to Eric. "Get ready to fight. The Taulen are counting on us." Eric's pulse quickened, his mind racing as he strapped himself into the seat beside her. "We can't outrun them forever. What's the plan?" Saren's gaze was locked on the view ahead, her face impassive. "We make our stand here. We'll engage the Ruthuri and make them regret following us. But we need to buy time for the Taulen coalition to join the fight. Once they're here, we'll have a fighting chance." Eric nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The Ruthuri fleet was far superior in both numbers and technology. The Astrakal was powerful, but it was still outmatched. They needed to find a way to outthink their enemy, not just outfight them. Without warning, Saren pulled the ship into a sharp roll, narrowly avoiding a blast from one of the Ruthuri ships. Eric's stomach lurched as the stars outside twisted into streaks of light, the ship's engines humming as they swerved to the left. His hands gripped the armrests as the ship shot forward, diving between two Ruthuri vessels. The Ruthuri opened fire, their plasma cannons lighting up the dark expanse of space. Eric could feel the heat from the blasts through the hull, but Saren's deft maneuvers kept them just out of range. "They're good," Eric muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the enemy ships. "But we can't keep dodging them forever." Saren's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't have to. Just keep them distracted. We're waiting for the Taulen." Eric glanced at the comm screen, noting that the Taulen ships were still not in range. His fingers itched for action, and yet he knew that waiting was the only option for now. He trusted Saren, her confidence, her experience. But as each moment passed, the Ruthuri were closing in, their guns charging with deadly precision. "This won't hold forever," Eric said, his voice tight. "We need to hit them hard." Saren's eyes flicked to him, and for the first time, there was a hint of a smile in her expression. "Patience, Commander. We'll have our opening." True to her word, the Ruthuri began to close in on them, surrounding the Astrakal from all sides. Eric watched, eyes narrowed. As their formation tightened, they were preparing for a final strike. "Now," Saren said suddenly, slamming her hand down on a button. The Astrakal dropped out of warp speed, throwing the Ruthuri off guard. Before they could adjust, Saren's fingers were moving faster than Eric could track, launching a series of blindingly quick counterattacks. The Astrakal unleashed its full arsenal, sending blasts of energy into the Ruthuri fleet. The powerful strikes hit their marks, but the Ruthuri were relentless, retaliating with even more firepower. Eric gritted his teeth. The Ruthuri ships had more advanced shields, but with every hit, their defenses began to falter. This was their chance. "Taulen ships are entering the system," Saren said, her voice suddenly calm again. "Get ready. We need to hold them off for just a few more minutes." Eric nodded, his mind sharpening as he prepared for the next wave. The Taulen were coming. They had to make it count. The Rutheri were fierce, but the combination of their firepower and the strength of the Taulen would turn the tide. And then, just as he thought it couldn't get worse, the Rutheri launched a massive salvo of missiles toward the Astrakel, the deadly projectiles whizzing through space. They were coming in fast, faster than he had time to react. His heart skipped a beat as the countdown on the ship's systems displayed the terrifying proximity of the missiles. "Brace for impact," Saren shouted, but there was no time to escape the barrage. Eric held his breath, bracing for the inevitable explosion that would tear their ship apart. But just as the missiles neared, a sudden explosion rocked the Rutheri ships as the Taulen arrived in full force. The tide of battle had shifted. The Rutheri fleet faltered, and with that opening, Eric's heart raced as he prepared for the final strike. The storm had arrived, and they were going to fight to survive. The Astrakel shook violently as another blast from a Rutheri ship struck their shields. Eric Vale gritted his teeth, gripping the armrests tighter as the ship rocked beneath him. The tension was palpable. All around them, the stars were alive with explosions, and the Rutheri fleet had intensified their attacks. But just as Saren had promised, the Taulen ships had arrived, their sleek forms darting into the fray, firing powerful bursts of energy at the Rutheri, causing their formation to splinter. "We're not alone anymore," Eric said, more to himself than to anyone else, as the Taulen ships moved with coordinated precision, overwhelming the Rutheri's defenses. Saren was in full command mode, her eyes never leaving the display screens. Each movement she made purposeful, her hands moving like a symphony conductor orchestrating a deadly dance. "Hold steady. We're not out of the woods yet," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. Eric felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The Rutheri were regrouping, and they were coming back with a vengeance. The air crackled with tension as the Rutheri ships formed a tight formation, preparing for their next move. "Here they come again," Eric warned, his heart pounding in his chest. Saren didn't flinch. "Just stay with me. We need to outmaneuver them." With a sudden lurch, the Astrakel dove down, narrowly avoiding another barrage of Rutheri fire. Eric's stomach lurched with the sharp movement, but he steadied himself, watching as Saren expertly piloted the ship between the gaps in enemy fire. Her hands were steady, her focus unbroken. The battle around them was a swirl of light and sound. Explosions filled the air as the Taulen ships clashed with the Rutheri, each side fighting tooth and nail for supremacy. Eric could see flashes of Rutheri fighters darting through the sky, their weapons blazing, while Taulen ships countered with precise strikes that sent Rutheri vessels spinning out of control. But the Rutheri were relentless, and their numbers were overwhelming. Eric knew that if they didn't act fast, they could lose this battle, and everything they had fought for could be gone in an instant. "We need to hit their command ship," Eric said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Take out their leader, and the rest will scatter." Saren's eyes flicked to him, her gaze sharp. She knew exactly what he was suggesting. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." The Rutheri command ship loomed large on the screen, its imposing structure a clear target. Eric's pulse quickened as they moved into position, the Astrakel darting between explosions, closing in on the enemy flagship. The Rutheri didn't seem to notice them at first, distracted by the battle surrounding them. But as they grew closer, the enemy's weapons turned toward them, firing with deadly intent. Saren's hands flew over the controls, and the Astrakel swerved out of the way just in time to avoid a massive blast. Eric's breath hitched as the ship narrowly dodged the attack, but there was no time to relax. The Rutheri command ship was almost within reach. They were about to make their move. "Now," Saren shouted, and with one swift motion, she launched a barrage of energy blasts directly at the command ship's engines. The enemy ship shuddered violently as the blasts made contact, the shields flaring and cracking under the pressure. Eric's heart raced as they fired again, hitting the Rutheri ship's vulnerable underbelly. The command ship's engines sputtered, and for a moment, Eric thought they had succeeded. But then, with a deafening roar, the Ruthuri flagship retaliated, launching a devastating blast toward them. "Brace for impact," Saren called, her voice sharp. The Astracal rocked violently as the blast hit their shields, sending shockwaves through the ship. Eric was thrown against his seat, his body slamming into the restraints as the force of the explosion rattled through the hull. For a split second, everything was silent. Then the comms came to life. Direct hit on their command ship, a voice crackled through the static. "It's going down. The Ruthuri are retreating." Eric let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The Ruthuri flagship was slowly breaking apart, its engines sputtering as it drifted helplessly in space. The rest of the Ruthuri fleet began to scatter, realizing they had lost their command structure. Saren's hand slowly relaxed from the controls as she took a moment to survey the situation. "We did it," she said, her voice low, though there was a glimmer of triumph in her eyes. But Eric knew that the battle was far from over. The Ruthuri might have been driven back for now, but this was only one victory in a much larger war. The galaxy was vast, and there were more threats on the horizon. As he looked over at Saren, he knew that their alliance, this unexpected partnership, was just the beginning. Together, the stars outside the Astracal were quiet now, the chaos of battle fading into the background as the ship drifted in the cold, silent void of space. Eric Vale sat at the communication station, his eyes fixed on the screen as he monitored the remaining Ruthuri ships, which had scattered in the wake of their flagship's destruction. The Taulen ships, too, had begun to pull back, their sleek forms disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the remnants of the battle behind. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Eric's thoughts were heavy as he looked down at the screen in front of him, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping on the console. The victory had been hard-earned, but he knew it hadn't been a permanent solution. The Ruthuri were still out there, and they would come back, stronger, angrier, and more determined than ever to crush their enemies. Saren Thalra, standing by the viewports, was lost in thought as well. She had been the one to keep the ship steady in the heat of battle, guiding them through the storm of enemy fire with a steady hand. But even she couldn't hide the toll the fight had taken on her. The quiet of the aftermath was a stark contrast to the urgency that had filled the air just hours before. Now, the Astracal was simply floating in space, as though it were waiting for something. Saren turned and walked over to Eric, her footsteps soft on the metal floor. "The Ruthuri are retreating for now. We've bought some time, but we both know it won't last long." Eric nodded, turning to face her, her sharp eyes locked with his, and he could see the burden of leadership in her gaze. Saren was a warrior at her core, but she was also a leader, and leadership meant making difficult decisions, decisions that weighed on her every day. "We need to plan our next move," Eric said, his voice steady. "We can't sit here waiting for them to come back. We need to strike first." Saren raised an eyebrow, considering his words carefully. "Strike first? Against the Ruthuri?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "It's not that simple. If we move too quickly, we risk drawing more attention than we can handle. The Ruthuri have far more resources than we do. One mistake, and we could be wiped out before we even get a chance to act." Eric felt the weight of her words. He knew Saren was right. The Ruthuri were a powerful force, and no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much they hoped for a decisive victory, they could never afford to be careless. But the desire to take action, to push forward and build on their success, was overwhelming. The Ruthuri were a threat to everyone in the galaxy, and Eric couldn't just sit idly by while they regrouped and rebuilt their strength. "I don't want to wait," Eric said quietly. "Every second we lose brings the Ruthuri closer to launching another attack. We need to act before they can regroup." Saren studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed. "You're not wrong. But we need to be strategic. The Taulen might have helped us today, but we don't know if they'll be willing to risk their lives for us again. We need more allies. If we're going to stand a chance, we need to find them. Eric considered her words carefully. The Taulen had been a crucial part of their survival in this battle, but they weren't enough. He knew Siren was right. They needed more allies, more resources, if they were going to defeat the Rutheri once and for all. We can't do it alone, Eric agreed. But we've made an impression today. We'll find others who will stand with us. There are factions out there, other groups, other species who hate the Rutheri as much as we do. We just need to find them. Siren nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. We'll start by making contact with those who owe the Rutheri nothing. We have to play the long game. One victory at a time. Eric stood up, his mind already turning over the possibilities. The Rutheri may have been defeated for now, but this was just the beginning of a much larger war. The galaxy was vast, and there were many players in this fight, some who were willing to risk everything to take down the Rutheri, and others who might only join the fight if the cost was high enough. I'll start making contact with the allies we can trust, Eric said. You keep the ship ready. We don't know when the Rutheri will regroup, but we can't let them catch us off guard. Siren gave him a sharp nod, her voice steady. Understood. We'll be ready. As Eric turned and made his way to the communications console, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The Rutheri would be back. The question was, would they be ready for them when they did? But as he looked back at Siren, standing tall and resolute, he knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't be fighting alone. They had each other. And that, he thought, was more than enough. The Astrakal glided through the quiet emptiness of space, its sleek form cutting through the silence like a predator on the hunt. Eric Vale sat at the communications console, his hands moving quickly over the controls. His thoughts were racing, his mind focused on the next step. They had won a crucial battle, but it was only a small victory in the larger war. They needed allies, strong allies, if they were going to have any hope of defeating the Rutheri once and for all. Behind him, Siren Thalris stood with her arms crossed, watching him with a look of determination. She was a natural leader, and Eric admired her strength. It wasn't just her skill in battle that made her formidable. It was her ability to think clearly and act decisively even in the most chaotic situations. But even she couldn't hide the tension in her posture. The war was far from over, and every decision they made could mean the difference between life and death. We need to make contact with the other factions, Eric said, his voice low. If we're going to stop the Rutheri, we need to convince them to fight alongside us. Siren nodded, her expression serious. I agree. The Rutheri won't stop until they've crushed everyone in their path. If we're going to have any chance, we need to unite those who stand against them. Eric shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the map of the galaxy in front of him. There were several factions they could contact, but each one was a risk. Some were more willing to fight than others, and some had their own agendas. But there was no time to be picky. The Rutheri were regrouping, and if they didn't act soon, they would be back in full force. We've made some enemies, but we've also made a few allies, Eric continued. The Taulen were with us in the last battle, but we can't rely on them alone. We need to find others who are willing to join the fight. Siren leaned over the console, studying the map with him. I've been thinking about that too. There's a resistance group on the planet Terith. They've been fighting the Rutheri for years, but they've kept a low profile. We could reach out to them. Eric's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind weighing the decision. Terith was a risky move. The resistance was known for being secretive, and the Rutheri had spies everywhere. But the people of Terith were tough, and they knew how to fight. If they could convince them to join, it would be a huge step forward. We'll make contact, Eric said after a moment. But we'll need to be careful. The Rutheri might be watching. Siren stood up straight, her eyes locked on him. I'll prepare the Astrakal for a quick departure. We'll need to move fast if we're going to stay one step ahead of the Rutheri. Eric nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. The Astrakal was their best chance at making it to Terith undetected. With its stealth capabilities and advanced technology, it could slip past the Rutheri patrols without leaving a trace. But they would have to be quick. They couldn't afford any mistakes. "We can't waste any time," Eric said, his voice firm. "If we're going to make this work, we need to be ready for anything. The Rutheri will be expecting us to lay low, but we can't afford to wait for them to make the first move." Saren's eyes glinted with a mixture of resolve and confidence. "We'll be ready." The ship's engines hummed as the crew prepared to leave, the vibrations of the ship traveling through the floor beneath their feet. Eric could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. The fate of the galaxy might rest on their ability to unite the scattered forces fighting against the Rutheri. He had never been one for politics, but now, more than ever, he understood how crucial it was to build alliances, to forge connections with those who were willing to stand up to the Rutheri menace. As the Astrakal began its journey toward Terith, Eric couldn't help but feel the gravity of what lay ahead. They were heading into uncharted territory, where danger lurked at every turn. But he also knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. The Rutheri had to be stopped, and if it meant risking everything, he was ready to fight until the very end. "We'll do this together," Eric said, turning to Saren. "No matter what happens." Saren gave him a firm nod, her gaze steady. "Together," she agreed. "And we'll make sure the Rutheri know that they've underestimated us." As the ship accelerated, the stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light. Eric leaned back in his chair, a sense of purpose filling him. This was just the beginning. The Rutheri might have won battles before, but they had never faced an alliance like this, united by a single purpose, driven by the desire for freedom. They were coming for the Rutheri, and this time, there was no stopping them. The Astrakal emerged from the dense asteroid field, its sleek hull reflecting the dim light of distant stars. The journey to Terith had been long, filled with tense moments as they navigated through dangerous regions of space. Eric Vale sat at the helm, his hand steady on the controls as he piloted the ship toward the planet. Despite the uncertainty ahead, there was a sense of resolve within him. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the key to forming an alliance that could turn the tide of the war. Saren Fowlera stood at the communications station, her eyes scanning the data coming through. The resistance on Terith was their best shot at finding the support they needed, but it wasn't going to be easy. The planet was under constant surveillance by the Rutheri, and any sign of rebellion would be met with swift retaliation. Reaching out to the resistance was a gamble, one that could either secure their future or seal their fate. Approaching Terith, Eric's voice broke through the quiet hum of the ship's engines. His voice was calm, but Saren could hear the strain beneath it. They were getting close to the heart of enemy territory, and any misstep could be their last. "We'll need to be cautious," Saren said, turning toward him. "The Rutheri are everywhere on that planet. If they catch wind of our plans, they'll stop at nothing to ensure we fail." Eric nodded, but his jaw tightened. "I know, but if we don't act now, we might lose this chance forever. The Rutheri are regrouping, and we can't afford to wait." Saren's expression darkened. She knew the stakes were high. The Rutheri were relentless in their pursuit of power, and every day they gained more ground in the galaxy. But there was something else at play, something that made this fight personal for her. The Rutheri had taken everything from her people, and she couldn't let them continue to spread their influence without a fight. "We have to be ready for anything," Saren continued, her voice firm. "The resistance may not trust us, and they may not be willing to join forces with us right away. We need to prove that we can offer them something more than just another battle to fight." Eric took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the planet below. "We'll show them that we're not just looking for allies. We're offering them a chance to strike back, together. The Rutheri need to know that the galaxy is no longer theirs to conquer." Saren studied Eric for a moment, considering his words. There was something in his voice that gave her hope. She had seen him lead them through some of their darkest hours, and now, as they approached Terith, She knew that he was ready to do whatever it took to make this alliance work. As the Astracal entered the planet's atmosphere, the ship shook slightly from the turbulence. The landscape below was rugged, marked with scars of past battles, a testament to the brutal occupation by the Ruthuri. Eric guided the ship carefully, maneuvering it into a hidden valley where the Resistance had established a secret base. Landing in 5 minutes, Eric announced, his eyes focused on the path ahead. The valley was nestled between tall cliffs, hidden from the Ruthuri's watchful eyes. It was the perfect place for the Resistance to regroup without being detected. Siren moved to the cargo hold, where the crew prepared to disembark. She adjusted her blaster at her side, making sure it was easily accessible. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission. It was a potential ambush waiting to happen. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. When the Astracal touched down, the air was thick with anticipation. The crew gathered in the landing bay, ready for whatever lay ahead. Eric and Siren exchanged a quick glance before stepping out onto the surface, their boots crunching against the rocky ground. The Resistance's contact was waiting for them, a tall figure cloaked in shadows, their face hidden beneath a hood. Eric's heart raced as they approached, but he kept his expression neutral. The person in front of them could either be an ally or an enemy, and every decision now mattered. "We've been expecting you." The figure's voice was low and gravelly. "But you're not the first to come here with promises of help. What makes you any different?" Siren stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "We're not just promising help. We're offering you a chance to end this war. Together, we can make the Ruthuri pay for everything they've taken from us." The figure paused, and for a moment, the silence hung heavy between them. Eric could feel the weight of the words, knowing that this was their only chance. If the Resistance didn't trust them, they might be walking straight into a trap. Finally, the figure lowered their hood, revealing a pair of piercing eyes. "You're bold, I'll give you that," they said. "But boldness doesn't win wars. Convince me you're worth trusting, and maybe we'll talk about what comes next." The atmosphere on Terith had thickened with tension. As Eric Vale and Siren Thalra stood face to face with the leader of the Resistance, every word felt like a weight on their shoulders. The figure who stood before them was a seasoned veteran of the ongoing war against the Ruthuri. This wasn't just another encounter. It was the moment that could either secure their future or shatter everything they had worked for. The figure studied them intently, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the valley. The people of Terith had endured years of oppression, and trust was something they had learned to give only to those who proved themselves worthy. Eric could feel the pressure in the air, the sense that every moment counted. His hands clenched at his sides, his resolve firm. This was not just about forming an alliance. It was about showing them they weren't just offering help, they were offering a chance at real victory. The Ruthuri had been too long in control, but Eric was certain that together, with the Resistance on their side, they could change the tide of the war. "We're not asking you to fight alongside us just for the sake of a battle." Siren spoke up, her voice strong. "We're asking you to stand with us for something much bigger. This isn't just a chance to win a single skirmish. It's the chance to defeat the Ruthuri for good. We have the strength, the resources, and the will to make it happen. But we need you. We need every single person who's been holding out hope for freedom." The leader of the Resistance did not immediately respond, but their gaze never wavered. It was clear they were evaluating every word, every intention behind the plea. Eric couldn't read their expression. Too much was hidden in the shadows, but he knew this moment would define everything. "We've heard promises before," the leader finally said, their voice low but steady. "We've seen many come and go, all with grand plans and empty words. You're not the first to claim they can end the Ruthuri's reign. But what makes you different?" Siren's expression hardened, but she held her ground. "Because we've already done it. We've already fought back. We've broken their chains in other systems, and we're willing to go further. We've seen what happens when people unite, when they fight for something bigger than themselves. And we're offering you the chance to join that fight. Eric stepped forward, his voice clear and direct. The Rutheri can't be stopped if we stay divided. But together, with the power of the Taulen, the fighters from Terith, and the fleet we gathered, we have the strength to make them retreat. We can make them crumble. There was a long pause as the resistance leader took in their words. Eric could feel the weight of their gaze, the uncertainty that had hung over Terith for so long. It wasn't easy to trust, especially after years of hardship and betrayal. But if there was any chance to turn things around, this was it. Finally, the leader nodded slowly, a slight shift in their stance. You speak with conviction. That's more than we've had in a long time. But words are only part of this. If you want us to fight alongside you, you'll have to prove it. Actions speak louder than promises. Saren's eyes narrowed. We're ready to show you we mean it. You won't regret this. The leader stepped back, signaling to someone behind them. A few moments later, a group of resistance fighters emerged from the shadows, their faces hardened by years of battle. Eric felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. They weren't just agreeing to fight. They were committing to a cause that would affect every corner of the galaxy. With a nod from the leader, the fighters stepped forward, their weapons in hand, ready to join the cause. Eric felt the surge of energy in the air. This was it. They had just taken a huge step towards securing the future of the galaxy. The Rutheri had underestimated the strength of those who refused to be crushed. And now, as the resistance fighters stood ready by their side, Eric knew they were no longer alone in the fight. We have a long road ahead, Eric said, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. But with you, we can end this war. We'll make the Rutheri wish they had never set foot in this galaxy. The resistance leader nodded, their eyes flashing with renewed hope. Then let's get to work. As the team gathered their gear and prepared to move out, the energy in the valley shifted. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt. Together, they had formed an alliance built on shared sacrifice, hope, and the will to change their fate. The Rutheri would soon learn that they had underestimated not just a few warriors, but an entire united front. And in that moment, with the resistance of Terith standing by their side, Eric knew they were one step closer to victory.